Are you a businesswoman who is finding it challenging to get your ideas across and make a point? Welcome to Speakers Who Get Results with Elizabeth Bachman, a podcast dedicated to helping women get the visibility they want, whether making a speech or talking in a meeting. Every week, get valuable lessons from Elizabeth or learn from her roundtable conversations with experts and speakers on how to make a difference, not just a point. On to the show with your host, Elizabeth Bachman.
Hello and welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and this is the podcast where we talk about leadership, presentation skills, cultural issues, and today we're talking about executive presence and how that's affected by our cultural biases. Before I get to my very interesting guest today, I'd like to invite you to see how your presentation skills are doing by taking our free 4-minute assessment at speakforresultsquiz.com. That's www.speakforresultsquiz.com. And that's where you can see where your presentation skills are strong and where perhaps a little bit of support could help you get the results you need and the recognition that you deserve. My guest today is Wendy Wang Kleinfeldt, who is a first-generation Chinese American, but she says she was also a third culture child because she lived in 4 different countries, China, Hungary, Thailand, and then America. So that's 3 different continents where she was other. Something else. She was seen as someone who didn't belong, and that's given her a really interesting perspective on the world. She draws her expertise from over 13 years of research and cross-industry experience in companies ranging from the public sector to global Fortune 100. With a master's degree in organizational psychology, specializing in leadership and evaluation, and a graduate certificate of coaching, she is now a consultant for executive women, helping them be their entire authentic selves. I think we had a really interesting, wide-ranging conversation. I know you'll enjoy it. On to the interview with Wendy Wang Kleinfeldt. Wendy Wang Kleinfeldt, thank you very much for joining us on Speakers Who Get Results.
Oh, thank you so much, Elizabeth. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, we have a very juicy list of things to ask you, but let me start out by saying, who would be your dream interview? If you could talk to somebody who's no longer with us, who would it be? What would you ask them? And who should be listening?
Wow. That's a really great question. And I couldn't really think of anybody in history. I think most people that I admire are alive. But when I really think about who would be a person that I would love to talk to so I can deepen my own understanding, and then when I think about a conversation that would help other people, I think it would be it's probably going to be a conversation with my granduncle, so my grandfather's brother. And the reason is because, in many ways, I consider my granduncle as a war hero. So during the time of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, or right before that, there was sort of a civil war. And I think a lot of people didn't know about this, between the Communist Party and like the Democratic Party. And my granduncle, my grandfather's brother, fought for the Democratic Party. And he died in battle. And because of that, my grandparents, my mother and her, so it's my maternal side of the family, they went through years of political persecution and their lives were extremely hard. And I think that conversation would be very eye-opening for people, because I think it's a part of history that really impacts us today. It's a part of history that I think we can learn from, because, excuse me, I'm seeing some signs of our social culture today that is actually was present at that time. And some of the
So,
questions,
so
go ahead.
basically, he was fighting, for those who haven't studied Chinese cultural history, and I have to confess, I studied it once, but it was a long time ago. Um, I had a friend who was obsessed with it in college, so we learned it all then. But
Mm,
basically fighting against Mao Zedong's forces, right?
yes. Yeah.
Okay. Before Mao Zedong and the communists took over.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All
Yes.
right. So
You're
I can
correct.
get
And
that.
so, yeah, for people who don't know, so Mao Zedong, the communism, his Communist Party and the party that's present today, you could trace it back to around the 50s when that kind of sort of took over. But there was a civil, there was a civil kind of war
Mhm.
that happened. And uh, essentially, the other side lost and then they went to Taiwan. So
Got
that's a
it.
little bit of history of the dynamic between China and Taiwan today, and reason why
Mhm.
China does not want to claim Taiwan as an independent country is because of that past. And
Well, and your mother's family being persecuted is, I mean,
yeah,
that is classic tyranny, that the
oh,
families are also persecuted for those who fought against the regime.
oh, absolutely. I
I've just
mean
been
that,
reading about Stalin, and that happened in Stalinist Russia.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, we could go on and on. It'd probably be a different podcast on kind of like the cultural experiences and the historical experiences of people back then. But one of the reasons I picked my grand uncle is because I would love to hear more about what his dreams were, right?
Hmm.
What got him, um, and I'm sure he didn't wake up one day and say, I'm gonna go into battle. I'm gonna, take up arms and do this. It probably wasn't a spur of the moment. So I would like to know, like, what was his thinking? What
Hmm.
was he feeling? What was his vision? What's his dream? What did he think he was fighting for?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
and I think that conversation would at the very least honor his death and honor his contribution because as we know, because his legacy basically was shredded
Hmm.
because that side lost.
Hmm.
So that's kind of, I know it's a very personal motivation, but I think it's a conversation that could be very educational for folks too, just to better understand not just not only what's happening here in the US, but just seeing the connection of what can we learn from that, right? I think
Hmm.
we can learn a lot about what to do and not to do, or what are the cultural signals to kind of be alarmed by learning through other countries' history.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's fascinating, and we should. I mean, that learning from history is so important. I confess, I think in historical cycles,
Yeah.
part of it is because I spent 30 years in the opera world, where we're dealing with
Mhm. Okay.
scripts that were written in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. So,
Yeah.
thinking about historical cycles, it also allows me to not fall into total despair when I look
Yeah.
at the news. It allows me to sleep at night when I think, okay, we've been here before, we
Yeah.
survived, we got
Yeah.
out of it somehow. So that
Hmm.
might be, um,
Yeah. I like
yeah,
that thinking because lately I've been saying, the pendulum is going to swing back. Like,
yeah.
we get scared about the recession, we get scared about the job market, whatever it is, we got to remember the pendulum always swings back. We've been here
But
before.
we have to do the work.
Yeah, we do have to
We
do
have
the
to do
work.
the work to stand
Yeah,
up for what we believe in.
yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. Yeah,
Oh, well, Wendy, we could go on about this for another couple of hours. And I think this is
yeah,
probably a conversation we do another day, maybe with a
yeah.
bottle of wine
Yes,
and have this
absolutely.
conversation. But you are a renowned consultant, especially in women's leadership. And since we are honoring Asian American Pacific Islander Month, um, can you believe it all came rolling out of my mouth like that? The AAPI month in
Yeah,
America, at
it can
least.
be a lot of words to say.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
I think there are like 17 different countries involved in this.
yeah,
I want to talk about executive presence
yeah.
and how, or the first question at least, is executive presence and how our cultural biases affect that? Because you've lived in 3
Mm.
different continents and
Mhm.
you've lived in 4 different countries. So,
Yeah,
uh, so let's talk to me a little bit about what you've seen around the world
yeah,
and what you see in your clients.
yeah. And this is a really interesting question because most days I walk around not even aware that I am myself an American now, right?
Hmm.
I think that part of my life is a lot shorter than the more global side of my life, where, like you said, I've lived in China, I lived in Hungary, I lived in Thailand, and then the US is kind of my most recent stop, if you will. And it's really interesting because you could split my time between, I could compare like what do generally people think about executive presence in Asia versus the Western world. And it is different. It is
Hmm.
different. And I think in every culture, the behavior traits that we admire as leadership traits. I'm very biased now towards the American experience because for the most part, I would say most of my clients, and I do have an international client, but most of my clients are American. And I was educated in the American education system, and this is the world that I grew up professionally in. So
Hmm.
my work is very biased towards the American side, but I still am always cognizant about how other folks look at what we do because I have international friends still. One of my
Hmm.
best friends is Ukrainian who's also French, and so
Hmm.
she oftentimes keeps me grounded by saying, "Oh my gosh, that's such an American thing. We wouldn't do that here, or we would do this here." And I go, "You're right. Yeah, of course." And
Hmm.
so, for example, with executive presence, what I've come to realize over the last couple months is we've gotten a pretty good sense in the US of what executive presence is. And oftentimes, I would say, unfortunately, a lot of people still associate it with being male. There's a lot of male characteristics that go with being executive, with the
And can
executive
you
presence.
define them for us? Because
Yeah, sure.
yeah, because this is a question
So,
I get all the time is what is executive presence? How do you
yeah.
define it?
So,
And actually just to something we were talking about before we started the recording is it is something that it's how you are perceived and the
yeah,
definition is from others. It's not
exactly.
something you can apply for yourself. Other people
Yeah.
decide whether you have executive presence or not.
Exactly. And so the way that I've best come to understand executive presence and try to teach it to my clients isn't necessarily so much about let's understand executive presence or like what is the definition, like in a dictionary definition. I don't know that we really can nail that down because people are going to disagree. What I think most people may agree on are the different components that make up executive presence.
Ah, okay.
So, for example, uh having deep knowledge, expertise is one of them. It's not talked about as much, but I think it's because it's considered table stakes, right?
Hmm.
If you want to be considered a leader, if you want to be considered somebody with authority, it's a given that you should be good at with whatever this area that you have authority in.
Okay. And for our international listeners, how do you define table stakes?
Oh, good call out. See, like I am biased towards the American culture now. So it's foundational, right? It's
Yeah.
assumed, it's taken for granted that that's one of the things like a precursor characteristic.
It's from the game of poker. And so
Yes,
table
it is.
stakes means that's the money that you have to put out on the table to to start the game. Everybody
Exactly.
puts a
Yeah.
certain number of chips on the
Yeah.
table to start the game. So it's a
Yeah.
reference to poker.
Yes,
Yeah.
very correct. It's kind of like
So
the
deep
it makes
expertise,
yes.
basic,
And
yeah.
And and a really big part of it is also charisma. Charisma is really is you could define charisma, and if you study leadership from an academic perspective, there you could even also study charismatic leadership. But part of it is also when you think about somebody who walks in a room and all of a sudden it seems like they've captivated the room.
Hmm.
It's hard to put a finger on that. It's hard to find a dictionary definition, but there's something about their energy, right? There's
Hmm.
something about their the way they relate to the world And a lot of people think of executive presence as somebody who's an extrovert, and that may be the bias in our American culture that we tend to award leadership traits to the ones who are the loudest and who talk the most. But executive presence doesn't necessarily assume that. I think
Mm-hmm.
you could be somebody who's more soft-spoken. For example, a lot of people I think would agree that Steve Jobs had executive presence, and he was not the loudest speaker. He was not the most boisterous voice. He was more soft spoken, but when he spoke, people listened.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
part of it is that he was articulate with his message. He knew what he stood for, he believed it. And
Mm-hmm.
so, this confidence piece is another element that I think, again, for international folks, table stakes, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've got that. And by the way, I heard a researcher give a very, I would say, probably the best definition of confidence that I've heard, which is it starts with you believing in yourself. If you believe, for example, that the next thing that's going to come out of your mouth is actually true, you would say it with more conviction than if you thought, I'm going to say this thing or I'm going to ask this question, but am I going to get dinged for it? Am I going to get laughed at? But if you
Mm-hmm.
truly believe in the validity of your experience and then you acted upon that, that is what confidence is.
I would call that being grounded in your authentic self.
Yes.
Authentic being another word that is overused and has,
Yeah.
and often people don't really know what it means, but
Mhm.
being grounded in your own value.
Yes. And I love that you brought up authenticity because that's the next component I was going to talk about is executive presence isn't, putting on a clown suit and say, here, I'm an executive, right? Or here, I'm a leader, you should listen to me. But there's that authenticity that you talked about, which is being very grounded in your values. And the thing is, authenticity is also one of those characteristics where as humans, I think we can pick that up right away. Like when we
Mm-hmm.
talk to someone, we can get that feeling right away. Is this person genuine? Is this person acting in a way where if I wasn't in the room, they would also be this way? And I
Mm-hmm.
like to look at authenticity as also an element, as a congruence between your words, your thoughts, and your actions.
So do you have more? Do you have more here? Because I've got another question.
Go ahead. This is a good place for you to
Well,
pop the
this
question.
so often a lack of executive presence is
Yeah.
an excuse to not give somebody a promotion.
Yeah.
That,
Absolutely.
oh, she just doesn't have the executive presence because she doesn't look like us.
Yeah.
So where does this come in when you are a person of color?
Yeah. I think when people get I don't think you have executive presence, I think that usually translates to you don't look like the leader that I would imagine a leader would look like. And that's to
Ooh.
the earlier point of how executive presence looks different, across cultures.
Mm-hmm.
So unfortunately, in many parts of Asia, and I wouldn't say all of Asia, but in many parts of Asia, when they think of somebody with strong executive presence, they're probably often thinking about a white man who's a
Mm-hmm.
corporate leader. And
Mm-hmm.
certainly when I was growing up, that was the ideal image of executive presence was this, this, for whatever, take it for whatever sort of as a kid, the idea of like the big, tall white man in a powerful suit and who can talk with conviction. That was the executive, like that was the
Mm-hmm.
ultimate leader. And then when you come to the US, that definition is a little more flexible where, you have folks like, I think we were just talking about, like Michelle Obama, Oprah, Brene Brown. I would say a lot of people look at them and say, yeah, they have some magic about them that when you look at them, you just know that you can trust them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when they talk, you're sucked in, you
Mm-hmm.
are captivated. Um, but yeah, it's just different across cultures. And I think when people think about who a leader is, they still have a prototype in their head of
Yeah.
who that is. And if you don't fit that prototype, it's almost a experience of cognitive dissonance. I don't know if folks are familiar enough with psychology to know what that term is. That means when you experience something that goes against a belief system or a value system, and now your psyche is at odds
Mhm.
because it's trying to reconcile a belief and also seeing something that is contradictory to it. So I think that's what people experience. And then so they can't put their finger on it, but really, if you ask them, okay, tell us the truth. What is it about this person who maybe not have executive presence? And you just, the truth may be they just don't look like a leader.
They don't look like, which means they don't look like the image I have in my head
Yes. Yeah,
for a leader. Oh,
exactly.
well, so what can we do about it?
Well,
If
that's a
we
good
don't,
question.
yeah,
Yeah.
what can you do?
And, I think about this question often of what can you do about it? Because I serve women
Mhm.
and there's and even as somebody who serves women, I still need to kind of be attuned to the balance of what I tell my female clients that they need to do differently versus
Mhm.
taking that ownership away from them and saying that this is not your accountability. Because we also ask a lot of women.
Mhm.
Anything that happens at work, oh, there's some systemic, maybe discrimination around, how women are perceived. Well, here's what you can do, women, to combat that. We put a lot on women to do something to try to change the system, where I think that's backwards. If there's something in the system that does not allow women to succeed or thrive in it, then we need to look through the system. That's not the women's accountability. What I do want my women clients, and just really any woman or anybody listening, is when we ask the question of what can you do about it, we have to be really clear of what are we actually asking here? Like where are we asking the solution to come from?
Exactly.
Women can't change other people's perception
Mhm.
as much as anyone can change anyone's perception. You can influence the relationship you create with others. You can
Ooh.
you can influence the experience you create for other people to be in your presence. So that's what I talk to my women clients about is regardless of whether you're in a situation where you're hitting a ceiling or some kind or any other roadblock, or maybe you're in a system that lets you thrive, you still want to be thinking about the leader that you want to be. And yeah, there's a lot that's being asked of leaders, and that's why they say leadership isn't for the faint of heart.
Mhm.
And as a leader, you do have to think about your brand. You do have to think about how you bring people into a relationship with you. You have to think about the experience of what it's like for others to be in your presence. And what are people saying about you when you're not in the room? This is not the same as trying to do reputation, management, or trying to do any kind of PR damage. That to me is kind of just, you have to do that to some extent as individuals and maybe even as public figures, but it's more of how are you instilling trust in others? How are you connecting with people as people? Because when
Mhm.
people trust you, I think they'll trust you as a leader. So to me, it's more about teaching women how to be good leaders in general, rather than challenging them to change the system by being different. So
Uh-huh.
so I want to actually encourage women to say, whatever you think the system is asking you to do, you need to first ask yourself, is that what I want?
Mhm.
So if whichever system they're in, if they're saying, you know what, in order to be an executive, you need to just dress like an executive. You need to be in a power suit. You need to do this or that, right? If that is the requirement to create that perception, I would say as a woman, whoever is in that position, to say, does it sound like something you would want to do? And some people say, yeah, I love doing that. That's a great challenge. I would love to, dress in power suits. That's something I love doing. That's how I can lean in. And some people say, you know what, it doesn't feel like me.
Uh-huh.
I'm more, I'm more this way. That's just not a fit. So you have to ask yourself, is that what you want?
I-
And how do you whether it is a fit or not, how do you want to authentically and intentionally express who you are?
I've heard you say you are more than your career.
Yes.
So expand, that sounds like that'd be a good place to add that piece,
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
authentically who you are.
Yeah. And I love that you brought that up because I think what's also missing when we talk about leadership in the workplace is recognizing the person, as a whole person. So, however you show up at work, you're still you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you may have had a bad night the previous night. Maybe your kid is sick. Maybe, you just had a fight with your partner. Whatever experiences you had, you're still bringing it into work. You may just not be expressing those emotions. You may not be talking about it. But the thing is, if those experiences are impacting you, you are still bringing them into work. And I heard a leader once say recently, that she's trying to work on building a team and she wants people to bring kind of their best selves to work. And then she quickly kind of gave the caveat, not their whole selves, because I don't need that here. I just need their best selves. And I just thought, how interesting, because you can't necessarily carve out the best part of yourself and say the rest of me can be left behind. We humans just don't work that way. We don't expect, people outside the corporate workspace to do it, but we somehow expect a lot of corporate leaders to show up that way. And so to me, authenticity is maybe coming to work. And if you're having a hard day, that vulnerability, that authenticity may be, you know what, I'm just having a little bit of a hard day today. So if I am slow to respond, or if I seem distracted, know that I am still listening, but that I'm just going through a hard day today. That is being authentic because you're not only acknowledging to yourself, but you're letting others into the world too of who you are. And
Mm-hmm.
so all that, so I know the question was started with, being more than your career. To me, it's recognizing your humanness before even thinking about your career. I think we put our career as like this thing that we can wrap ourselves around rather than as uh just it's an experience we walk through life. Your
But it's kind of
career just
like a suit you can put on and take off. Or
yeah.
you be a lot of people find that they're different, try to be different people at work than they are at home. And
Mhm.
granted, some things are appropriate and some things are not, but
Sure.
being your whole self, uh, in some ways it feels like a very American feeling too, but I think
Oh,
it's also a very
absolutely.
healthy feeling.
Yeah, and I always, say, because I know like we had this conversation that there are a lot of jokes about the American experience and about being American, out, different places that you may visit. But there's, I think what I can credit to the American culture is that we have a lot of language around respecting the authentic self and talking about the whole person. We have a lot of
Mhm.
language. We have a huge platform to talk about that. And now with mental health too. And I think that's healthy because again, this all goes back to the original question of like, what does it mean to be bigger than your career? Because I think our career is not our life.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
and this can be a grounding reality for women out there who are frustrated with their career, is to take a moment and check and do kind of an inventory of the things in your life that you really take priority on, that are most meaningful to you. And you'll realize that the energy you're putting into your career may not be the place where you want to spend your energy. And I want to be careful here because I don't want this to become a soundbite where I'm saying that women don't need to spend energy into their career. But what I'm trying to say is, if you're finding that your life energy has been put in your career and you're struggling, I want you to take a step back and recognize that you are more than your career. You have this whole life, whatever may be filled in your life. And so you can try to take perspective and say, is this the path that I'm walking towards with all this resistance, with all these obstacles? Is this still the right path? And if it is, am I going down the path the right way? Are there things that I have overlooked? Do I need more friends? Do I need more partners? Do I need a mentor? Or do I need to walk this path in a different company?
Mhm.
So it's about not locking yourself into any one career plan that doesn't serve you. And that's what really my message is that your career is yours and you're bigger than your career because your career is something that you can action, but it shouldn't action on you, if that makes sense.
I love that. I love that. Well, we're close to the end of our time, but I wanted
Yeah,
to ask you a couple of things, especially as a woman of color,
sure.
uh, how we can support more women of color. And you
Hmm.
mentioned that you've been betrayed by women of color.
Yes.
And
Mhm.
now you could see why that happened. You
Yes.
could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's interesting because when people hear those stories of, me having felt betrayed by a lot of women and also by, other women of color, um, they might ask, well, why is that your mission then? Why is it your mission then to serve, to continue to serve women rather than saying, I serve both men and women. And it's not that I reject male clients, by the way. So, because I still have, because I do have a male client. But my mission to help women is to help them realize that they can be self-empowered and that they don't necessarily need to fit into any mold to feel like they're successful. And the reason why I think I've had those experiences of betrayal by other women or women of color, I think is usually what I call kind of the queen bee effect, which
The
is
what?
queen bee effect.
The queen bee effect.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's where a lot of these women have, basically crawled through nails and glass to get to where they are.
Right.
They grew up professionally at a time where they were maybe the only woman in the room,
Oh,
or maybe
yes.
the only whatever, fill in the blank in the room. And so to rise up, they probably had to adopt behaviors that weren't authentic to them. They probably had to show up in a way that didn't feel congruent to who they are, but it was hard and they kept their head down and worked hard and got there. And once they got to the top, suddenly the scarcity mindset takes over and they say, you know what, I worked my entire life for this. No one's going to jeopardize this. So that means if there's another woman behind me, and again, a lot of this I think is
Hmm.
unconscious. I don't think any woman really is maliciously doing that. Most of them I don't think are in that position. But there's this unconscious, scarcity mindset that comes in and says, these women that are coming up behind me, they better not take this away from me because there's
There's
only,
only room for so many.
yeah.
Yeah. There's only room
And
for one, for
yeah,
instance.
there's only room for one. Or there's this mentality, and I've heard some women leaders say this. It was this hard for me. It was so hard for me. Why should it be easier for you?
Ah, yes. Yes. Men and women say that. Yeah.
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 Yeah. And I think to answer the question of how can we support Asian American women, Asian American leaders, I well, first, I think there is a level of awareness just to maybe, to kind of adopt and nurture. We're not all the same. So when
Hmm.
we even say the umbrella Asian American or Asian American and Pacific Islander, that's still pretty big umbrella. The
Hmm.
Chinese culture is vastly different from the, Korean, Japanese cultures, and they're right next to us,
Hmm.
a short flight. And then you go down south a little bit, and then the Thai culture, I lived in Thailand, vastly different, and they're right next to, other Southeast Asian and Southern Asian countries like India, Myanmar, or Burma, and Vietnam, and the Philippines and Malaysia. They're all kind of clustered in that South region, and they're all different. And so when we say Asian American, we have to remember that that's just a shortcut to say
Yes.
people from generally that continent. And so part of that support comes in just honoring that we're different. And so when people say Asian American, but then they often miss a lot of the Indians out of that group, like I don't
Right.
think that's fair to them either. Right.
Right.
And so there's an element of like, let's not just generalize us as the Asian Americans, right? Like understand us as, just we have our own unique culture and we're also individuals at the end of the day. Right. And I think there's another element of if somebody who has grown up here or who only has moved here as an adult, just be
Here
aware
being
that,
America, right?
sorry.
Yes. Here being America.
Yes, here in America. Yes, sorry for the international listeners. Yes, whether you grew up in the US or maybe you moved to the US as an adult, just be cognizant that that there may be cultural nuances, right? So I didn't grow up in the US. I grew up in Hungary, and there's still parts of my behavior that seem very, very Chinese. And then there are parts of me where, my family who are living in China would say, you are so not Chinese. So there's different there's different kind of degrees of like how much of the culture they've brought it in. So just being cognizant that some of the behaviors may just be cultural in nature, and you can be curious, and what I mean by that is, for example, what I've often heard when I lived overseas was, Asians don't speak up, it's so hard to work with, a lot of Asian teams because, they don't ever say anything. They're just quiet in meetings. It's like, well, because in their culture, you defer to the leader and you don't say anything until you get a permission to speak. So just being cognizant that they may or may not, right? It's a may or may not be still bringing some of their cultural upbringings, whether they grew up here or not here in the US. So I think part of it is just recognizing that. And I think curiosity goes a long way. When we talk about Asian American experience, and women of color experiences, I think it becomes easy for people, especially Americans here, to feel like they have to walk on eggshells around us when they ask us questions. And again, I don't represent everybody in my group, but I will say, me personally, I actually really appreciate it when someone is curious about my culture, about my background, and ask about it. Like, I don't take offense to it. To me, it speaks, oh, you're genuinely curious, So if someone says, hey, can I ask about your background? How do you do this? How do you do that? And I appreciate that, because that to me says that you are curious enough and you took courage to, in time of your day, to understand a little bit about me that you wouldn't have otherwise. And when it comes to leadership, again, there's a little bit of that, like, we need to change some of the system of like how the system works, of how they incorporate different people into leadership. And then there's the human aspect of how people behave in corporate culture. And when it comes to leadership, I'll bucket that under unconscious bias, right? Whatever idea of a leader you have in your head, I want you to continuously challenge yourself and think about all the leaders that you have maybe admired or continue to admire today in the community, who may not look like the prototypical executive leader, but is somebody you honor and respect, and they're a leader in a different way, maybe.
I love that. That actually is a great line to finish on. So, Wendy, thank you so very much for joining us on Speakers Who Get Results. It's been a delight. And when I get back to America, you and I, we're going to sit down and have this historical conversation over a bottle of wine. Absolutely.
Yes.
So, dear listeners, readers, and watchers, this has been Speakers Who Get Results. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to us on YouTube, tell your friends. Tell your friends and leave us a good review on Apple Podcasts. That's the one that counts. And tell everybody so that we can have more great guests like Wendy Kleinfeldt on the show. This has been Elizabeth, Speakers Who Get Results. I will see you on the next one.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
We have just concluded another great episode of Speakers Who Get Results with your host, Elizabeth Bachman. If you got value from today's episode, please feel free to share us with your friends and colleagues. You may also visit elizabethbachman.com for additional resources. Be sure to tune in every week for new episodes, and thanks for tuning in.